Bitter winds clawed at the Idaho cabin, threatening to freeze the very marrow in David Garrison's bones, while neighboring homesteaders mocked his grueling, mud-caked labor. He silently laid another brick. They called his massive labyrinthine masonry heater a fool's errand. Soon that same folly would become their only salvation. The off-grid settlement of Boundary Creek sat nestled in a jagged, unforgiving valley in the Idaho Panhandle. It was a place where idealism met the brutal reality of nature, and in the autumn of 2014, nature was preparing to deliver a masterclass in cruelty. There were 14 families scattered across the heavily timbered acreage, a mix of rugged survivalists, disillusioned city dwellers, and seasoned loggers. Among them was David Garrison. David was not a logger. He was a former structural engineer from Chicago who had traded steel high-rises for a heavily wooded plot of land, seeking quiet after a devastating personal loss. From the moment he arrived, he was viewed with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. The unofficial leader of Boundary Creek was Richard Cobb, a bear of a man with a booming voice and a philosophy entirely rooted in immediate, aggressive action. To Richard, survival meant loud chainsaws, massive stockpiles of cordwood, and heavy black cast-iron stoves that could turn a cabin into a sauna within 20 minutes. When the leaves began to turn a sickly, bruised purple in late September, the settlement went into overdrive. The Farmer's Almanac was predicting a winter of historic savagery, the kind that froze diesel in the tank and snapped pine branches like dry spaghetti. Chainsaws echoed through the valley from dawn until dusk, but David's plot remained eerily quiet. Instead of felling hundreds of trees, David was waiting for a delivery. The trouble started when a flatbed truck rumbled up the rutted dirt road, groaning under the weight of 3 massive pallets. Richard Cobb, alongside his right-hand man, William Thatcher, stood by the muddy track, arms crossed, watching as David signed for the delivery. "What in God's name is that?" Richard asked, kicking the tire of the flatbed as the driver began unstrapping the load. "Fire bricks," David replied, his breath pluming in the crisp air. "Refractory mortar and cast-iron clean-out doors." William laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You building a pizza oven, Garrison? Winter's going to hit in 6 weeks. You barely have 2 cords of wood chopped. My cast-iron Fisher stove is already installed and roaring. I'm building a Russian stove," David explained calmly, unrolling a set of blueprints on the hood of his battered truck. "A masonry heater. It's an ancient design, a pechka. It doesn't just radiate heat like a metal box. It traps the exhaust gases. The smoke travels through a labyrinth of internal brick channels before it ever reaches the chimney. The thermal mass absorbs the heat and radiates it slowly for 24 hours on a single short, hot fire." Richard leaned over the blueprints, his eyes narrowing at the complex diagrams of internal baffles, downdraft channels, and secondary combustion chambers. "This thing is huge," he scoffed. "It's going to take up a quarter of your living space, and it weighs— what? 4 tons? 5.5, David corrected. Richard shook his head, looking at David as if he were looking at a dead man. "You're a fool, David. A cast-iron stove gets hot right away. If you come in from the freezing cold, you want heat now. This pile of rocks, by the time it warms up, you'll be an icicle. Not to mention, it's going to take you weeks to build. You should have spent that money on an Appalachian stove and a hydraulic splitter." "Cast iron is wildly inefficient," David argued, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "Most of the heat goes straight up the chimney. You have to feed it constantly. You'll be waking up at 3 in the morning to throw logs on the fire, and you'll burn through 8 cords of wood this winter. I'll burn through 2. "Theory is great in an office building, engineer," Richard sneered, turning away. "But out here, theory gets you killed. When you're freezing to death in January, don't come knocking on my door." The settlement quickly caught wind of David's project. He became the running joke of Boundary Creek. They called it Garrison's Folly and the Brick Tomb. While the others spent their days bonding over split logs and the smell of two-stroke engine oil, David worked in isolation, hauling 80-pound bags of mortar and mixing them by hand in a wheelbarrow. The sheer scale of the project was staggering. David had to reinforce the floor joists of his cabin just to support the astronomical weight of the masonry. He dug deep into the frozen earth to pour an independent concrete footer. Every brick had to be soaked, buttered with a precise thickness of refractory clay, and laid with agonizing perfection. If the internal channels were even a fraction of an inch off, the draft would fail, and the stove would choke on its own smoke, filling the cabin with deadly carbon monoxide. The psychological toll began to weigh heavily on him. By mid-October, a freak early frost killed the last of the valley's foliage. The temperature plummeted to 15 degrees overnight. Walking through the settlement, David could see the warm, orange glow of firelight flickering in the windows of his neighbors' cabins. Plumes of thick grey smoke billowed from their metal chimneys, a testament to the raging fires within. David's cabin, however, was dark and freezing. He couldn't light a fire. The Russian stove was only half built, a gaping maw of damp red brick sitting in the center of his living room. He slept in a sub-zero sleeping bag, wearing 2 layers of thermal underwear, a wool hat pulled down over his eyes, shivering violently as the wind howled through the poorly insulated walls. One afternoon, Sarah Jenkins, a pragmatic former nurse who lived a half-mile up the ridge, stopped by. She brought a thermos of hot chicory coffee, her eyes scanning the chaotic, dusty interior of David's cabin. "You look terrible, David," she said softly, handing him the steaming cup. His hands, cracked and bleeding from the harsh lye in the mortar, shook as he took it. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just need to finish the secondary combustion chamber today." "Richard says you're not going to make it," she said, her voice laced with genuine concern. "He says the mortar won't cure properly in these temperatures. If you start a fire in that thing, the water, expanding in the damp clay, will crack the whole structure. It'll collapse." David stared at the intricate brickwork, the doubts creeping in like the frost on his windows. "Richard doesn't understand thermal dynamics," he whispered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Richard understands Idaho," Sarah countered gently. "Please, David, swallow your pride. William has a spare steel barrel stove. We can help you vent it out a window for the winter. You can finish your science project next summer." David looked at the half-finished masterpiece. He thought about the engineering, the elegant efficiency of the design. To abandon it now meant surrendering to the brute force, inefficient methods of the others. It meant admitting defeat. "No," David said, his jaw tightening. "I'm finishing it. I know what I'm doing." Sarah sighed, pulling her heavy coat tighter around her. "I hope so, David, because once the snow flies, we won't be able to reach you." The first major twist of fate occurred precisely 3 days later. David was in the final stages of capping the bell of the stove, the large internal void where the superheated exhaust gases would expand, slow down, and transfer their thermal energy to the brick walls. He was exhausted, running on black coffee and adrenaline. The temperature outside had dropped to a bitter 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and despite his efforts to keep the cabin somewhat warm with a small propane space heater, the cold was seeping into everything. He was reaching for a stack of specialized refractory bricks when he heard the heavy crunch of tires on gravel. He walked to the window and watched in horror as William Thatcher's heavily modified diesel pickup truck, hauling a massive log splitter, backed up to turn around in David's narrow driveway. William wasn't paying attention. The massive steel bumper of the log splitter slammed into the last remaining pallet of fire bricks David had staged near his porch. The sound was a sickening crunch of shattering ceramic. David burst out the front door, slipping on the icy planks of his porch. "Hey! Hey, stop!" William slammed on the brakes, leaning out the window. "Whoa! Sorry about that, Garrison. Blind spot." He didn't sound particularly sorry. He glanced back at the wreckage. Over half the specialized fire bricks, the ones strictly required for the intense heat of the firebox core, were pulverized into useless orange gravel. David fell to his knees in the snow, staring at the shattered bricks. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "These have to be shipped from a foundry in Ohio. It took 4 weeks to get them here." William shrugged, putting the truck in drive. "Shouldn't have left them so close to the turnaround. Look on the bright side. Maybe now you'll give up on this stupid brick oven and get a real stove. Send me a bill for the rocks." The diesel engine roared as William drove off, a thick cloud of black exhaust settling over the ruined materials. David sat in the snow for a long time. The freezing air stung his eyes, but he refused to let the tears fall. Sarah was right. The settlement had written him off. They didn't just think he was a fool, they actively despised his deviation from their norms. But David was an engineer, and engineers solve problems. He couldn't buy more fire bricks. The roads were already getting slick with ice, and a freight truck would never make it up the mountain passes now. He had to improvise. Returning to his cabin, he dug through his old university textbooks, desperately searching for historical alternatives. The original Russian peasants didn't have high-tech refractory bricks from Ohio. They used what was in the earth. He found a passage detailing traditional cob and clay sand mixtures used in Siberian pechkas. The next morning, under the pale, weak light of the winter sun, David took a pickaxe and walked down to the frozen creek bed at the edge of his property. The work was agonizing. He had to hack through 6 inches of solid ice and frozen mud just to reach the dense, grey clay beneath the riverbank. Every swing of the pickaxe sent shock waves of pain up his arms. He hauled 5-gallon buckets of the freezing, wet clay back to his cabin, his boots soaking wet, his toes entirely numb. For the next 4 days, David didn't sleep. He mixed the raw river clay with sand and chopped straw he had scavenged from the settlement's communal barn under the cover of darkness. The mixture was foul-smelling and freezing cold to the touch. He molded his own bricks, shaping the core of the firebox by hand, smoothing the internal channels with bleeding fingers. As he worked, the radio crackled with ominous news. A massive Arctic front, a polar vortex, was descending from Canada. Meteorologists were warning of unprecedented low temperatures, potentially dropping to 40 below zero, accompanied by a blizzard that could dump 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours. By the time the final layer of brick and clay was laid, David was a ghost of a man. He had lost 15 pounds, his eyes were sunken, and a deep, hacking cough rattled in his chest. The stove was a behemoth. It stood 6 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, occupying the entire center of the cabin. But it was finished. Now came the most dangerous part, the curing process. As Sarah had warned, if he built a raging fire right away, the moisture trapped inside the thousands of pounds of wet clay and mortar would boil, turn to steam, and literally blow the stove apart from the inside out. He had to cure it slowly. For a week, as the outside temperature plummeted into the single digits, David burned only small, pathetic handfuls of kindling in the massive firebox. The tiny fires provided absolutely no ambient heat to the cabin. The temperature inside hovered barely above freezing. He could see his breath in his own living room. To the rest of Boundary Creek, David's cabin looked abandoned. From the ridge, Richard Cobb pointed out David's chimney to a group of men gathered around a roaring bonfire. "Look at that," Richard laughed, pointing a gloved finger at the thin, wispy, almost invisible trail of white vapor coming from David's flue. "The man is burning twigs, a week before the biggest storm of the decade, and he's got no heat. He'll be frozen solid by Tuesday." "Should we go check on him?" William asked, though he didn't sound eager. "Let him learn," Richard declared coldly. "I told him cast iron was the only way. You coddle a man when he's being a stubborn fool, you just breed more fools. When the cold breaks him, he'll come crawling to my cabin, begging to sleep by the Fisher stove. And I'll let him, after he admits he was wrong." Inside the freezing cabin, David placed his bare hand against the side of the massive brick structure. It was cold to the touch, but deep inside, he knew the moisture was slowly being driven out. The clay was vitrifying. The structure was hardening into a single, monolithic thermal battery. On November 12th, the sky turned a bruised, apocalyptic grey. The wind died down completely, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence over Boundary Creek. The radio crackled one last time with an emergency broadcast before the signal died entirely. The storm was here. David looked at the mountain of split birch and tamarack wood he had neatly stacked by the door, only a fraction of what the others had, but exactly what he calculated he would need. He opened the heavy cast-iron door of the firebox. It was time. He struck a match, touched it to a bed of dry bark and newspaper, and piled on the heavy logs. He left the draft fully open. The fire roared to life, a terrifying, violent inferno swirling inside the brick belly of the beast. The flames licked upward, aggressively pulled into the intricate internal labyrinth he had bled to build. Outside, the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall, descending like a white curtain over the valley. The storm did not merely arrive, it descended upon Boundary Creek like a suffocating white avalanche. By midnight on November 12th, the ambient temperature plummeted to 35 degrees below zero, driven by gale-force winds that ripped heavy branches from ancient pines. The blizzard blinded the valley, burying the rutted roads under 4 feet of dense, drifting snow in a matter of hours. Inside his cabin, David Garrison sat on the edge of his cot, watching the furious inferno through the small glass pane of the cast-iron firebox door. For exactly 2 hours, he let the fire rage. The dry birch burned with a ferocious intensity, completely consumed in the highly oxygenated environment. Unlike a conventional metal stove, which required damping down the airflow to keep the fire burning longer, a process that created thick, unburned smoke and dangerous creosote. David's Russian masonry heater was designed for brief, explosive combustion. The exhaust gases, burning at nearly 2,000 degrees, were forced down and around the internal clay baffles he had so painstakingly molded by hand from the freezing riverbank. Then, the fire died down to a bed of glowing red coals. David stood up, his breath still visible in the frigid room. The air temperature inside was barely above freezing. He reached out and engaged the heavy steel shut-off damper, sealing the chimney completely. This was the terrifying leap of faith. In any other stove, shutting the flue with hot coals inside would fill the cabin with lethal carbon monoxide. But the masonry heater's sealed firebox and massive thermal mass were built precisely for this. The heat had nowhere to go, but out into the room. Slowly. For the first hour, nothing happened. David wrapped himself in 2 heavy wool blankets, shivering, wondering if Richard Cobb had been right. Perhaps the clay was too thick. Perhaps the hand-mixed mortar had failed. The walls of the enormous brick structure remained cool to the touch. But at 3 in the morning, the physics took over. The heat wave hit not as a blast of hot, dry air, but as a profound, penetrating, radiant energy. David woke, throwing off the heavy blankets, suddenly sweating. He walked to the center of the room and placed his palms flat against the rough, vitrified clay surface of the stove. It was hot, like a stone baked in the desert sun. The 5.5 tons of masonry had absorbed the violent energy of the short fire and was now releasing it as gentle, consistent infrared radiation. It warmed the objects in the room, the walls, the floor, and David's own bones. He checked the mercury thermometer hanging by the frost-covered window. When he had lit the fire, it read exactly 0 degrees inside the cabin. Now, a mere 5 hours later, the red line had climbed steadily to a balmy 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a staggering 68-degree differential, achieved with an armful of wood that would have lasted 20 minutes in a conventional cast-iron unit. He wouldn't need to light another fire for 24 hours. A mile down the ridge, Richard Cobb was fighting a losing battle against the elements. His massive cast-iron Fisher stove was glowing a dull, angry cherry red. The metal was radiating searing heat within a 3-foot radius, but the rest of the cabin was freezing. The brutal, sub-zero wind howling outside created a massive negative pressure differential. The steel chimney was drafting so hard it was quite literally sucking the ambient air right out of the cabin, forcing Richard to burn wood at a terrifying rate just to keep up. "More wood!" Richard barked at his wife, pulling his heavy jacket tighter around his shoulders. "We only have a dozen logs left inside," she replied, her voice shaking from the cold. "The rest is under the tarp outside, but the snowdrift is over the porch railing. We can't reach the pile." Richard swore, grabbing the heavy iron poker. He jammed another massive log into the firebox, forcing it shut. The stove roared like a jet engine. That was his fatal mistake. For months, Richard had been damping down his stove at night to make the wood last, a common practice that starved the fire of oxygen and coated the inside of his steel chimney with thick, highly combustible, glazed creosote. Now, desperate for heat, he had the draft fully open, sending 1,000-degree flames licking up into the dirty pipe. A sound like a freight train suddenly echoed through the cabin. The stovepipe began to shudder violently, turning from dull black to a terrifying, glowing, white-hot orange. The creosote had ignited. It was a full-blown chimney fire. Sparks and massive sheets of flame shot out of the chimney stack into the blizzard above, threatening to set the cedar shake roof ablaze. Inside, the metal pipe began to buckle and warp from the catastrophic heat. The smell of burning metal and sulfur filled the room. "Get the baking soda! Get the snow!" Richard screamed, panicking. He threw open the cabin door, the blizzard instantly blasting a snowdrift into the living room. He scooped up a bucket of raw snow and hurled it directly into the roaring belly of the cast-iron stove. The reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The freezing snow hit the cherry-red cast iron. A massive cloud of scalding steam erupted, followed by a sharp, deafening crack. The thermal shock split the heavy cast-iron firebox right down the middle. The structural integrity of the stove failed completely. Smoke and toxic fumes immediately began pouring into the cabin through the jagged fissure. Richard fell back, coughing violently, staring in horror at his ruined primary heat source. The fire was dead, smothered by the snow and the shattered iron. Outside, the temperature was 38 below zero. Inside, the temperature began to drop by the minute. Richard Cobb, the undisputed survivalist of Boundary Creek, was suddenly out of options. By the dawn of the 3rd day, the merciless blizzard finally broke, leaving Boundary Creek entombed beneath 4 feet of blinding white powder. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic, exhausted pounding on Sarah Jenkins's heavy oak door. She unbolted the latch to find Richard Cobb and William Thatcher shivering on her frost-covered porch. They looked like hollowed-out ghosts. Ice clung to William's blue lips, and Richard's trademark arrogance had entirely evaporated, replaced by the hollow stare of a desperate man. "My Fisher stove is dead," Richard rasped, pushing past Sarah into her freezing kitchen. "Crack the iron right down the middle, putting out a chimney fire. We have no heat. William is out of dry wood. We have to group up." Sarah pulled her children closer, her breath pluming in the cold room. "We barely have enough wood to last the week, Richard. What about the others? What about David?" "Garrison is a corpse," Richard said grimly, rubbing his frostbitten hands. "He was burning twigs before the storm. That brick tomb of his froze solid. But his cabin is heavily insulated. We can use it as a windbreak, maybe rip up his floorboards for fuel. Wrap the kids up. We move now." The trek to David's property was a grueling, agonizing slog through waist-deep drifts. It took 3 hours of brutal labor, their muscles screaming against the paralyzing chill. When they finally crested the ridge, they stopped in their tracks. David's cabin was buried, but what chilled Richard to the bone was the chimney stack. It was completely dead. Not a single wisp of smoke, nor even a faint heat shimmer, disturbed the freezing air. "Like I said," Richard muttered, his voice dropping. "He's gone." They shoved through the snowdrift, burying the porch. Richard grabbed the doorknob, bracing himself for the grim sight of a frozen body, and pushed inward. Instead of a freezing crypt, a physical wall of heat hit them. It wasn't the harsh, dry, smoky air of a metal stove. It was a profound, enveloping radiance. It felt like stepping onto a sun-baked desert rock. Richard stumbled backward, blinking in absolute disbelief. Sitting comfortably in a rocking chair, wearing only a light cotton t-shirt and jeans, was David Garrison. He was calmly reading a paperback, a steaming mug of coffee resting nearby. The cabin was immaculately clean, sitting comfortably at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. In the center of the room, the massive, mud-smeared monolith stood completely silent, its firebox dark, yet radiating an immense, unyielding wave of thermal energy. "Close the door, Richard," David said mildly, marking his page. "You're letting the draft in," Sarah gasped, pushing past the dumbfounded men. "David, how? Your chimney is dead. There's no fire." "I burned 1 armful of wood yesterday morning," David explained, patting the warm clay wall. "The thermal mass captured the exhaust heat. It holds the room steady." William stripped off his frozen gloves and pressed a trembling hand against the brickwork. A ragged sob escaped his throat as the heat instantly seeped into his freezing flesh. It's hot." Richard Cobb stared at the small, neat stack of firewood by the door. Barely enough for a single night in his ruined metal stove, yet enough for a week here. The man who had mocked the engineer was completely undone by the simple, indisputable reality of thermodynamics. "My iron stove cracked," Richard confessed, the admission tasting like ash. "We're out of fuel." "We are freezing, David." David looked at the men who had ostracized him. He could have turned them away, but survival was no longer a solitary endeavor. "There's space by the bell," David said softly. "Get your gear inside. And William, next time you bring a truck to my property, park on the road." The brutal winter of 2014 forever altered Boundary Creek. David Garrison's masonry heater, once mocked as an engineer's folly, became the beating heart of the settlement. When the spring thaw finally arrived, the deafening roar of chainsaws was replaced by the quiet, rhythmic scraping of trowels. One by one, the cast-iron stoves were dragged into the scrapyard, traded for clay, brick, and the enduring warmth of a harder lesson learned.